It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, and just contact me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure to check out our Patreon, Opperman Report Patreon. You can hear everything you hear Monday to Friday, AM, FM radio. You can find on the Patreon with all the commercials and the ads cut out. Plus, there's a lot of exclusive content on there. I was just interviewed over at Matt Connaughton Unleashed in New Hampshire about the whole Hunter Biden laptop story and connections to Stormy Daniels, all that kind of stuff. That's up there too as well at the Opperman Report Patreon. All of our archives are free. Go to Spreaker.com and you can search all over our free shows up there. I put up new content. I put up repeats every single night of the week. There's new content comes out Friday nights. I do a live show exclusive to the podcast community on Friday nights, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. There's a chat room, and you get an email notification anytime I put up new content. So that's Spreaker.com, and it's totally free. We have today Al Jones, and he runs this group on Twitter called the Q Origins Project. Now, you can find that at Q Origins on Twitter. If you go there and then way more detailed, like an archived listing of all their material can be found at dchan.qorigins.org. And he's written this excellent article you could find on bellingcat.com, The Making of QAnon, a Crowdsourced Conspiracy. So, Mr. Al Jones, you're there.
Yes, I am. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much. We've tried to touch on this QAnon story a few times from different angles. And when you look back at it, it really has been a big factor in the past, since 2017. It had a lot more influence than people realize. But before we get into your group there, the QAnon, the Q Origins Project, tell us about yourself. Who is Al Jones?
Sure. On one level, I am just an internet rando, but don't worry, listeners, I am an internet rando who genuinely understands a great deal about the subject matter. But I think, like most people, my first encounter with QAnon in particular was with somebody who I knew a little bit about, who should absolutely have known better, and who thought that the messages of this anonymous internet author were genuinely coming from the United States government, genuinely intended to warn people about huge upheavals that were coming out in the world in the immediate future and would change everything. And what really drew me in was that this person works for the United States government in a communications capacity as a relatively high-level civil servant. She, of all people, should have known that this is not how the government communicates messages to people, and it's not any of the channels the government would use, but even she was drawn in. So when I first encountered this, it blew my mind, and I felt like I had to sort of drop everything I was really interested in and were previously interested in and go to town learning everything I could about what is this belief system, how did it start, how did it spread, how has it created a sort of subculture that has captured people who, like my friend, genuinely, just from their day-to-day experiences, should know that none of it's true. So essentially the answer to your question is, I'm somebody whose brain works in such a way that I move from research interest to research interest, become entirely fascinated by it, sort of set fire to all of my spare time for months on a time to learn everything I can about it, and then I want to share it with the world. In the case of QAnon, that subject has enough sort of mainstream interest that sharing it with the world, attracts an audience and brings in, folks like you, folks like your audience, who also want to learn, what is this thing? Why does it matter? How does it work? As seen both from the inside and the outside of the group.
And then how do you come at this? Like, what is your background? Computer technology? Do you come back at this as a 4chan advocate who spends a lot of time on Reddit and 4chan looking at all this kind of stuff?
So, without getting too deep into my biography, both because I think that's bad radio and because my partner of indeterminate gender had a long talk with me when I started doing this about staying anonymous so that, nobody shows up on a doorstep with a gun and a burning desire to discuss anything I've written. I can say, I was a humanities major. I love history. I bounced from sort of history topic to history topic, sociology topic to sociology topic, with that same single-minded research focus for a long time. And how do I put this? What unites most of my research interests is the question of how is it that particular subcultures use language and group identity to structure the way that they see the world, discuss the world, understand current events. And in that vein, like QAnon is just a rich research vein for that, precisely because the core indicator that someone is a part of QAnon culture is that they use the Q drops, Q's messages, to understand current events, to shape their understanding of how the world really works and what we as American citizens or worldwide or citizens of whatever country we're in should be doing. It's just a fascinating subculture. But I don't claim, I wouldn't say I have like specialized technical expertise. I wouldn't say I have specialized academic expertise. I'm definitely a lay expert. And for people who do want more of an academic take on how conspiracy culture works, I cannot recommend highly enough the work of Michael Barkun, B-A-R-K-U-N. His book, A Culture of Conspiracy, is like it's my desert island book. He wrote it long before QAnon, but you can see the sort of building blocks of how something like QAnon would emerge from conspiracy theory culture from the features of conspiracy theory culture going back decades, just in that one book.
Gotcha. So Al Jones was a guy who was on. You followed other conspiracies in the past.
Yes. Actually, let me back that train up. I followed, groups that I considered fringe or even simultaneously fringe and influential. So like Scientology was one of my first research interests, precisely because of what I was mentioning about Scientology had its own vocabulary, its own set of sort of scriptures and ritual practices that let them understand the world in a way that is very distinct from wider culture. From that, I kind of moved on to Mormonism and evangelicism. Mormonism in part because I was just interested in the religious aspects of Scientology too, not just the language and social ones. But aside from Scientology, Mormonism is one of the great American religions. So I got interested in that, bounced over to evangelicism, and there again you have, a subculture that is quite influential, but does speak its own language, have its own set of beliefs, its own, distinctive worldview, and seeks to make that worldview real through political action. So all of these are sort of building blocks on the way to trying to understand QAnon, although obviously I couldn't have seen them like that at the time because all of this was long before QAnon existed.
And your research into like Scientology and stuff like that was on 4chan and Reddit and those type of forums? I can't remember the exact name. They were on message boards. They weren't necessarily 4chan or even Reddit, but that, back when Anonymous was attacking Scientology, that was my entry point, and there were, specialized boards devoted to that where they would post long compendiums of, here are L. Ron Hubbard's tapes, here is training material from Scientology, and I would sort of dive into all this wonderful primary source material and try to understand how does this religious movement construct a world around this core of material, and how does that world function now when L. Ron Hubbard is dead? What keeps people in it? What keeps the movement working? No, you're not thinking of Usenet, are you? The old alt Scientology forums?
No, these would have been. Oh gosh, I can't even give you a year for it, but these would have been much more modern boards than Usenet.
Gotcha.
I'm not quite old enough to have been around alt Scientology.
Yeah, I know. It's so funny because, I was there in the thick of all that stuff, the old Usenet days. And now these kids all make fun of me. Oh, Ed would never know how to use Reddit. Ed would never know how to use. Yeah. Meanwhile, I was there in the beginning, way back when Usenet, when these topics were fresh.
Yeah, you used Reddit's great grandpa.
Yeah, right. Okay, now tell me we brought you on here because you run this group, the Q Origins Project on Twitter, Q Origins. Yeah. So now, what is QAnon and why should we care?
Yeah, so QAnon is an apocalyptic millenarian movement, and what I mean by that is that the apocalypse is sort of the end of the old political and social order in the United States. That's what they're looking for. And they specifically want it to end in a spasm of violence called the storm, which we'll get to in a moment. And the millennium that they look forward to is sort of the unopposed reign of President Trump, in which he will release cures for all diseases, completely rework the financial system so that the little guy comes out on top and the big guy is destroyed. It's essentially a paradise on earth. And, there have been a lot of social movements that said, essentially, once we kill all of our enemies, which is what the storm is the anticipated mass arrest, incarceration, show trials, and execution and everyone who's ever opposed Trump with any level of political power, basically. After we kill all of our enemies, we will unleash a beautiful paradise is a really common sales pitch. It's a really common idea. It has occurred in many societies at many times. It's always been really bad news for the society as a whole to have a lot of that energy sloshing around in the political system. That's why I think we should care about it. It's not just that QAnon, when you get super into it, can be deeply destructive of your family relationships and friendships, although it can. It's much more that having millions of people ardently looking forward to the mass executions of their enemies and sincerely believing that that is the way to unlock a new, beautiful golden age of patriotism, peace, and prosperity is super dangerous.
Yeah.
For the rest of us.
Yeah, just my own cursory. And by the way, I was tipped off about QAnon like the first week it came up, because people throw that stuff at me all the time. But just a cursory review of this material. They're openly advocating rounding people up, round them up, the enemies, round them up, send them to Gitmo.
Yep.
And then they also, now it gets so far-fetched that that they have rounded up these people. These are their clones. They've been replaced with clones and actors. And Hillary is at Gitmo. This is just a clone. And then even beyond that many people have faked their death, like JFK Jr. And they've even come up with a guy, Fusco, who they think is JFK Jr. The guy's he's got his own name. He's a real guy.
So there are actually two separate JFK Juniors, and those are just the big mainstream ones. I also follow a much smaller one on Twitter who I don't really care about. He doesn't have much of a following. But we'll say there's two mainstream, quote-unquote, JFK Juniors in the QAnon movement. And at one convention I watched, both of them were invited. They had the two JFK Juniors in the same place at the same time, and it blew my mind. But nonetheless, this is a real thing that happens. But I don't like too much to talk about, here are the goofy beliefs of QAnon, because that makes people think, these are morons, they're not a threat. They are a threat. And can I briefly dwell on, the career of one of these JFK Juniors to show why they matter, why they're a threat to genuinely the American way of life?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So one of the JFK Juniors goes by Juan O'Savin. His real name is Wayne Willett, but we'll call him Juan just because everyone calls him Juan. So Juan, in the 2022 election cycle, worked with a former state legislator out of Nevada to put together a slate of Secretary of State candidates. These would be the highest election officials in, any given state. And these were not like fringe marginal candidates. A whole bunch of them won the Republican primaries, including in several swing states. Michigan's Christina Caramo, Marchant himself in Nevada. In Pennsylvania, the governor appoints the Secretary of State. They endorsed Doug Mastriano as the governor, who won his position. These were people who are motivated by that apocalyptic Millenarian belief I told you about to seek political office in a way that would let them put a thumb on the scales for their preferred candidate in upcoming elections. And that to me is why, yes, you can sometimes laugh at, these saps think JFK Jr. is alive. But one of those JFK Juniors made a genuine, serious, concerted effort to transform the fabric of American politics and came very close to actually doing that. In fact, one of the coalition's candidates in Indiana won. So
Yeah, and
it's not just fringe weirdos.
Yeah, Ken Watkins was there January 6th. He was staying at the Trump Hotel in D.C. on January 6th. And also his son, Code Monkey, ran for office, I believe it was in Arizona, Georgia, something like that.
Yeah.
And now, what do you, since your whole game here, right? Your whole claim to fame is the Q Origins project. Where do you think this originated? Because you got different people. Well, they mentioned Schoenberger, Cicada 3301. People mentioned Ken Watkins, the pig farmer down in the Philippines. There was that whole thing on HBO about the coming storm, which is a great series. It's like a soap opera watching that. So even if you don't know who Q is, it's just wonderful to watch. It's just fascinating. There's Paul Vallely and Aquino. Where does Al Jones land in this theory of how all this got started?
So,
right?
it's a big question. So, I have a couple of sometimes conflicting thoughts, precisely because it's a big, complicated question, and what I try to do is operate as analytically as I can, meaning that, sometimes when you're analyzing a big, conflicting mess of evidence, you have to have two different ideas in your head at once. But broadly speaking, my current money is on a single unknown poster or small group of posters living somewhere in the Pacific time zone in the United States, and with extensive business travel to Asia. And the reason I'm not tossing names out there is it truly is an unknown person or group of people. But how I got there is that my team found some forensic evidence related to timestamps on photographs that Q had posted, specifically, or metadata, I should say, of photographs that Q had posted. And we were able to determine, okay, some of, the vast majority of these, well over 60% of these, come from the East Coast. A bunch of other photos were posted from a time zone that includes China, and many of the subjects of these photos were in China. So we can conclude that somebody, I beg your pardon, the 60% come from the West Coast, not the East Coast. But anyway, the point is, we can conclude that the only two places we know that Q or somebody feeding photos to Q is West Coast, China. And beyond that, you start to get into speculation. There are ways to eliminate suspects, and this is what I try to focus on when people ask me who is Q. For instance, we look at Q posts that are replies to something. This is really getting into the weeds, actually. Do you want me to go to that level of detail?
Yes, please. Yes, you're fine.
Okay. All right. So, to narrow down the identity of Q, one of the things we've tried to do is establish physical whereabouts for Q or the person who gave those photos to Q, which to me, it would all be part of a Q team if there is one. But one of the ways we can do this is that there's a series of photos taken in a specific city in China, which I've been able to pin down to, okay, these were taken from this hotel, looking out at this specific building in a period between December of 2017 and January of, or I think in late January, early February possibly of 2018. And you can say, if you come up with a suspect for Q, if you can look at his passport stamps and find out, oh, he is in Shanghai in this period, that's a really good suspect. If you come up with somebody who claims that they are the only Q and they don't have that, maybe they're not such a good suspect. But I try to think about what can we prove with cold hard evidence and not get too much into, okay, here's one group of suspects with maybe nothing to hardcore confirm them. Here's another group of suspects with nothing to hardcore confirm them. Precisely because I think someone out there does know the answer and they will need, vetted, well-produced information that narrows down the suspect pool and can confirm or disconfirm whatever evidence does come to light.
Well, Al Jones, let me ask you this, because when Q first started posting, and people would say, well, how come you're posting in this cryptic fortune cookie type language? And he would claim, well, I have to do this, otherwise the government bots will find me and the spiders will find me and they'll blow my cover, right? And this is, that's a long time ago. There's no reason for, it's out, who's Snowden, he talks in regular English now. These people all talk in regular English now. So there's no reason for Q to keep using this fortune cookie language. But even still, even with the fortune cookie, okay, now you mentioned you got this hotel in China. It's a simple matter for the Central Intelligence Agency and Department of Defense Intelligence for these agencies to be able to find out everyone who was staying at that hotel on that day. And to blow somebody's cover on 4chan and all these spots, 8chan, is a simple matter for the NSA to locate and identify who this person is if they were really revealing secrets. Correct?
Yeah. And in fact, the recent leaker got caught within about a week of the leaks becoming, widespread public knowledge. Q, on the other hand, first posted in October of 2017, and the latest Q post, which probably are not made by original Q, again, for reasons I'm not sure you want me to get into, the latest Q post stretched all the way into July of last year. That's a very long time to go unapprehended if you are really waging a high-profile shadow war against, the most elite people in the world who have enormous resources to catch and deter you. It's one of the many reasons we can be very confident that Q's information is not legit. I also feel a little bad because we've gotten this far talking about Q and QAnon and mentioning Anons and never defining any of that.
Go ahead.
Should I give a vocab primer?
Sure.
All right. So Q is, like I say, the anonymous poster or posters who make content that's called drops. Those go on to image boards, 4chan, 8chan successor service 8kun, and exclusively image boards. There is no non-internet sewer way to access, there's no non-internet sewer way for Q to get their posts out. There are ways to access it that really clean it up so that you don't have to go onto 4chan and see, a wall of pro-genocide memes and slurs. You don't have to go on to 8kun and see the same. But that's getting more into QAnon culture. So that's Q, the source of the post. Anons it's sort of a dual purpose word. It's people who believe in QAnon, which is the sentence we'll be using it, and it also means image board denizens in general, because most of them default to using the word anonymous as the username. If you don't enter anything else in there, everyone is anon. And QAnon is just the movement that has sprung up around the Q posts, which has its own distinctive set of beliefs, its own distinctive culture and cultural practices. They often use the Q posts as essentially a sort of scripture. Like if you've done Bible studies, watching Anons bake or try to interpret a Q post will really bring you right back to a good, vigorous Bible study, except with very different rules of evidence. So that in a nutshell the difference between QAnons and QAnon. Online, you'll also find Anon saying, there's Q, there are Anons, there is no QAnon. Mention QAnon, you will get a bunch of these people. The problem with that hypothesis is that Q literally told them to start saying that in, I want to say, October of 2020, in a specific drop, because the optics of QAnon had gotten pretty bad and it was time for rebranding, for digital camouflage. So if you do encounter that particular talking point, just roll your eyes at it. It's not true. They spent years talking about QAnon, holding podcasts about QAnon, producing books about QAnon, and then when Q told them to drop QAnon, they did. As a phrase, they did. But one of the most prominent QAnon promoters out there used to go by QAnon John. Of course QAnon is a real thing.
Now, you mentioned, too, about how, they would drop these clues, and then just like Bible study, people would try and interpret these scriptures, right? But if you think about it, if the guys, if they already have the answers, okay, you know what I mean? If there's a team working here and then QAnon is dropping clues and preordained, they already have these answers out there to certain people to come up, to figure out the clues. Follow me? Al, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Right. You understand what I'm saying, all right?
Sorry, run that last part by me again. A couple seconds dropped out.
That's okay. You got QAnon dropping these clues, right? And then you have these researchers and forum experts and whisperers who are coming up with the answers to those clues. But if you come up in advance, if you're in cahoots all together, you'll hand out the answers to what the clues are in advance, and these guys will come up with the answers to the clues, which is what I think I've seen a lot of. Am I crazy or what?
No, you're not necessarily crazy. There is one popular theory among experts, so obviously not among Anon, but one popular theory of who QAnon, who Q is. I do occasionally flip up and say QAnon when I'm referring to Q, because 4chan has this long tradition of fake insiders who are like X-Anon, FBI Anon, CIA Anon, White House Insider Anon. There's another one who's like Anonymous 5. And in the early days, people would say QAnon. Now we try to say Q. It doesn't really matter. But, okay, circling back here. One of the popular hypotheses is that original Q, the author of the first Q drops, probably was in contact with a bunch of the early Q influencers. One of them, Paul Ferber, wrote a memoir alleging that a particular user, Red Raider, was on one of the early Q-focused Reddits, was Q and was in contact with Ferber and a couple other prominent people. Generally, I have no hard proof of this, though. So I'm really leery to commit to saying this is definitely true without hard proof, because I think what separates me, I hope what separates me as a genuine lay expert from a crank with very particular ideas, is that I want to be super cautious about endorsing, X is definitely true, when the visible evidence just says X cannot be excluded, or even X is probable. Does that make sense to you, though?
Yes, it does. Even with a confession, we're never going to fully know who's behind all this. Even with a confession with documentation, we're still not going to really know what's behind all this. Because
that is true.
Yeah.
Because I do think Q is a 4chan veteran, and part of the reason for this is when you really dig into Q's early posts on and start asking questions like, where does this specific line come from? Why is Q using this particular idea? You can see that, Q has definitely been around 4chan for a long time, and Q knows how to speak that language of fake insiders very well. You can actually find another fake insider, Mega Anon, explicitly praising Q for being the best in the biz. But the thing about the fake insiders is they're trolls, and they're trolls on a forum, 4chan, that, is notorious for trolling of various sorts, from, short, pointed, and racist to big, long, and elaborate. And you can't really trust somebody who lies like they breathe. So you're right. Even if somebody brought a signed confession out, produced authenticated original material, that's like, here is the text file in which I wrote the original Q drops along with some of my notes, and this could somehow be authenticated, I still wouldn't trust anything they said beyond the hard evidence, because they lie all the time, and they've been conducting this elaborate hoax and, in my opinion, laughing at the believers. And that's not a baseless opinion, but again, I'm worried that I've been talking too long, so I can leave it there or substantiate as you prefer.
Yeah, don't worry about talking too long. You're doing fine. No, but I kind of get the drift that you're thinking that it originated as a LARP, a live action role play, which was my theory for a long time too, right? And then what do you think? You think it was hijacked then by? And if it was hijacked, was it hijacked by grifters, or was it hijacked by intelligence, either capitalist intelligence or government intelligence?
So again, we're going to run into the core problem of I don't want to say for sure X happened when it's very much questionable.
Gotcha.
But the question of Q's identity being hijacked is, a somewhat contentious one among both the earliest Q believers and Q experts. So the reason people raise it is that QAnon starts on 4chan. At some point, the Nazis on 4chan, essentially, are so overwhelmingly hostile and flooding every Q post with trolls, with trolling and so forth, that Q sort of takes his ball and jumps ship to 8chan. So the question then is, then there's this complicated series of events that is extraordinarily bad radio, but it's covered really well in the HBO documentary.
Yeah.
That looks from the outside an awful lot like a coup is going on, where somebody has stolen Q's trip code, which is a unique method of identifying themselves, and is posting as Q and telling people not to listen to people who say they're not Q, and asking Ron Watkins, Code Monkey Z, the son of 8chan's owner, to confirm their identity and then set up a separate board where they won't have to deal with these skeptics. To an outsider, that really looks like somebody has, grabbed the identity and run with it. I've asked, and I believe that for a while. That is the mainstream position among QAnon experts, meaning outside observers, not members of the movement.
Yeah.
I've since moved away from that belief because I think that a couple key pieces of evidence, like post-coup Q, meaning, Q after this setup of a new board, had access to photos from the same photo roll as pre-Q, as, the poster. Okay, so when Q moves to 8chan, or before Q moved to 8chan, Q posted, a particular photo taken from an airplane in flight. After the supposed Q also posted a photo taken pretty clearly it's the same clouds, same general area, taken at a slightly different time. So to me, that says, oh no, this is the same poster. But you can find people who say, maybe it's a small group of people posting as Q, maybe these are stills from a YouTube video or something on Dailymotion or something, and if you know what video it is child's play to get another photo from that video. And that's plausible as well. So, I don't know if there was a coup. I'm not willing to commit to it. There are great reasons to think that there was. I personally think there wasn't. Ultimately, it's a question mark.
So then you believe, and again, with the caveats, right, that you believe that the live-action role play from beginning to end, the same characters.
Yes.
Okay.
And not quite to the end, I should add, because the person I would consider to be original Q last posted, I want to say it's December 8th of 2020.
Right.
And then there's this long hiatus. And then in mid-2022, through a series of complicated but extraordinarily stupid bumbling maneuvers, in my opinion, the board owners of 8kun, Jim Watkins, his immediate circle, which probably includes his son Ron, but also includes a couple other people. Somebody from the inner circle must have been the one posting as Q, because they changed. So remember earlier when I said that Q used something called the chip code to authenticate their posts? They changed the way that chip codes were generated, and then after that change, somebody got Q's self-same chip code to populate on a new drop, which should be completely impossible unless they did something on the back end to specifically, either produce that custom chip code if you put in a given password, or otherwise make it appear when they want it to appear that they wrote and dropped. So there definitely was a coup in 2022, but prior to that, I do think it was one person.
Al Jones, what do you make of characters like Michael Flynn and who's this other guy here? I mentioned it before. Paul Vallely was a general. Now, these guys should know better, right? And they should also know, too, and it wouldn't be a big deal either for CIA or NSA to go in there and defeat all these trips and hijack it themselves and make it their own operation. It's very simple. So then what do you make of these characters, of these generals and Flynn and Vallely, who somehow endorse Q as real?
I think Flynn in particular has a couple sets of incentives to do that. One is that I think he agrees with the overall ideological project of QAnon, which is sort of, bringing about this America in which the lids are violently suppressed and, a Trump dictatorship essentially ensues. I'm very much down on that. That would be the end of the Republic as we've known it and the start of something much darker and uglier. But I think that is fundamentally his political project. And actually, he was one of the people who walked into the White House in December of 2020 and tried to convince Trump to, have the National Guard seize the voting machines and quote unquote rerun the election. Like he's taken concrete actions towards that kind of thing, enormously destabilizing political activities that would, shape America in the way he wants to have it shaped. So the other incentive he had is financial. As most people know, I think Flynn was indicted and I believe pled guilty, but then appealed. I'm not an expert on the procedural details here, but he racked up enormous, like approximately $4 million worth, enormous amounts of debt to pursue that appeal. And the thing about Anons is they will give to their heroes, and Flynn is sort of a tier one hero to QAnon followers. Nonetheless, since Q stopped posting, since Trump left office, Flynn has, I do want to be clear, has said, there's not actually a plan the way you guys think there's a plan. You are the plan. You, meaning Anons, have to take local action to have a national impact. The whole overarching storyline is bunk. But Anons, of course, immediately responded to that with, he doesn't say it for optics, but he knows there's a plan.
Right.
Because the movement is very resilient to evidence that it's not really true.
I hear you, man. They come up with an excuse for everything, and it's all part of the big trust the plan, keep waiting, it's all coming. But one of the things that really strikes me is because they showed up in 2017. If this guy really had some kind of inside knowledge, wouldn't he have been able to predict the pandemic? Because according to these folks, the pandemic was all fake and planned. Wouldn't the guy had one job, right? So wouldn't he know about that if that was according to them?
You think he would? But one of the fascinating things about QAnon culture is that they will present themselves as, meaning the Anons and Q, will present themselves as for different reasons, being like independent thinkers or having inside access to real information about world affairs. But when you look from day to day at the nitty gritty of what they're discussing, they're just talking about whatever was on Fox News, man.
Yeah.
Like, there's even a few drops that says, watch Hannity. They're not, you're quite right, and they don't have inside information, but one of the cool things / terrible things about QAnon culture is that it has so many resources to say that doesn't actually bother me whenever any inconvenient fact comes up. So many thought-terminating cliches. Trust the plan is one. Disinformation is necessary is another really big one, where anytime one of Q's prophecies is false, well, disinformation is necessary, man.
Yeah, and it seems like they have a bunch of trolls on speed dial too. Because just recently, I told you I've had a couple of incidents, and people I've never seen before, they're commenting all kinds of stuff about me, and then you go look at their profile, and it's WG1, WGA, where we go one, where we go all. I have no connection to these people whatsoever, and suddenly they're all experts on me. So it's just, again, when we mentioned the whole Cicada 3301 and Victor Schomburger. Again, too, this whole big everyone who's ever mentioned him gets bombarded online with trolls and all kind of stuff. That one. But what about people who point toward Ken Watkins and Code Monkey? Do they experience that same kind of trolling?
Oh yeah. So there's two Watkinsons actually. It's Jim Watkins, who is Watkins Senior, and Code Monkey, who is his son. I don't know that I would say they have exactly a troll army, but I will say that one of the things you'll see if you watch Q Into the Storm is that Ron Watkins worked with Jason Sullivan, who is Roger Stone's comms guy / social media guru, currently working for RFK Jr.'s campaign. That's Sullivan, not Watkins. Watkins, as far as I know, is not. But Sullivan got in touch with Ron Watkins and was like, I will give you access to this tool that will enormously boost your reach on Twitter. And sure enough, when you look at what Ron Watkins was doing post-2020 election, his reach on Twitter did just absolutely explode. And part of that is because he was trying to rebrand himself as a serious election security thinker who had, and I'm not joking about this was his primary claim, that he was a large systems analyst who had read a manual for a voting machine. And that was enough to get him on, I think it was OAN or possibly a similar fringe network. But he was also out there promoting things like, promoting essentially the idea of hang Mike Pence if he won't throw the election to Trump. He has a political project that is almost identical to Q's. He has some deep and abiding ties to the QAnon movement. I don't think he cannot possibly be the sole poster the sole poster behind Q for a couple of reasons, one of which is simply that he's very online. If he's awake, he's posting. And when you look at timestamps of his, of his Twitter activity, for example, you can see, this blank space where there are no timestamps is where he's sleeping. Well, the nice thing about Q is also very online. And you can narrow down when Q was active and posting by looking at the replies Q made to, anons just posting in boards, within, say, 15 minutes of the original post. And then from that, you can figure out, okay, when is Q not active? When is Q asleep? Well, you look at those two sleeping periods, they don't match up even a little bit. They don't even overlap because Ron is living in Japan, Q is living in the Pacific time zone. And very quickly, for me at least, I was able to say, this guy cannot be solely Q. But is he part of a group that, constitutes all of Q? Like, is Q a group effort? Maybe. If Q is a group effort, is Ron Watkins part of it? Maybe. There's some intriguing documents floating around from even early QAnon history that directly assert that Ron was part of a group of the sort of Q steering committee. But I can't authenticate those. Again, there's a strong temptation to go, this person is a villain, therefore they did the villainous thing, that is QAnon. Mm. But I try really hard not to dive into that with both feet because I want to be thoughtful and evidence-based and avoid the very direct air of, I hate this person, therefore they did the thing that I hate.
With their intimate involvement in the 8chan and 8chan and all this stuff like that, do you think that they would know who the identity of Q is?
I think that is almost certainly true.
Okay.
They would at least have... So one possibility is that they, at the very least, know what password Q was entering and could seize control of Q at any time. So, again, there's the possibility that Q's control was yoinked and Q was locked out of the ability to reproduce it, to reproduce the chip code. So that's one way they could be Q. Even if they're not directly writing the posts, they have to know, like they have the ability to see where people are posting from.
Yeah.
And I also, how do I put this? The fact that they are able to authenticate, this is Q or this isn't Q, means that even if you further say, okay, you also can't prove that they know who Q is, which I can't ironclad prove it, and I shouldn't say I can say they control whether anyone else recognizes a Q post as coming from Q. So then they're at least waist deep in it and probably neck deep in it, even if I can't speak to what exactly the higher ups at that board know for sure.
Now, you mentioned earlier that, refresh me again. Jim is the father, yes. Ken is the son.
Jim is the father, Ron is the son.
Ron is I'm totally wrong. Yeah. Ken is the father.
No worries.
Okay.
No, I'm awful with names, so I get it.
I always call him Pig Farmer and Monkey, Code Monkey. But now the thing is, now you said that these two had the ability to elevate Twitter reach?
No. So Ron was approached by Jason Sullivan, who is, like I said, Roger Stone's comms guy, Roger Stone's social media guru. And Sullivan is the one who said, here, I'm going to give you this tool. It will vastly boost your Twitter reach. But I'm not really sure that Ron has the technical chops to create such a tool himself. And I know for a fact that Jim does not. There's no way on God's green earth that Jim is not a technical person.
Yeah, I got that too from somebody that worked for him. Jim being the pig farmer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Although they have sold the pig farm.
I was going to mention that too as well. Ex-pig farmer. Okay, let's not slander pigs and all this. But now, so there is definitely, this group has the ability to elevate certain people on Twitter, which is clearly, obviously going on with certain people out there. Now, what about with the entrance of Elon Musk? Do we see things worse or better on Twitter as far as that kind of thing goes?
Substantially worse.
Yeah.
QAnon is definitely back on Twitter. Like, QAnon culture now lives on Twitter again in a way that it hasn't since, the great purge of January 2021, basically. And I do want to add that a lot of the swarming behavior you're talking about, where, you talk about QAnon, you get a bunch of very obviously QAnon affiliated people popping up in your mentions is organic too, in the sense that, there are Q influencers, many of whose real names we know, like, Praying Medic, for example, is a guy named Dave Hayes, lives in Arizona. Lots of other examples I could give. Those guys are also extremely online, and they will occasionally post, oh, so-and-so said XYZ, and then their followers, some percentage of them, will go to the comment and troll. So it's not necessarily directed harassment coming from Q themselves, whoever Q might be. It's just that there's this whole ecosystem that is built up around the Q posts, and now that there are no more Q posts, they're basically just conspiracy influencers. And they need content, and they need conflict in order to keep their share of eyeballs. And so I guess I wanted to be really direct and clear about that because, some of the stuff you see on the internet might have sinister motives behind it, and a lot of it is just because the architecture of social media is such that it encourages really bad behavior like this. And I guess I didn't want to just go, oh yeah, it's all centrally directed to influence discussion of QAnon so much as, boy, there are a lot of incentives for people to act like this that are not necessarily sinister. They're just unfortunate.
I gotcha. So we only got about 8 minutes left now. So I'm sure I left out a lot of questions that you'd like to address. What haven't I asked you that you want the audience to know?
Good question. I guess one thing I do want to stress is that I am just a lay expert. I did a really bad job of introducing myself and may not have sounded like a lay expert. No, but I promise, cross my heart, I am a lay expert. But there are also some academics who have done phenomenal work on both conspiracy culture in general. I mentioned Michael Barkun. I want to plug his work again. A Culture of Conspiracy is a really fantastic read for understanding the internal logic of conspiracy theories and the sort of subcultures and movements that spring up around them. There's also a guy named Marc-Andre Argentino, who may or may not be leaving academia now that he's actually completed his thesis, but is one of the sharpest thinkers I know. And it's spelled MARC-ANDRE ARGENTINO, and I would encourage all y'all to at least give him a follow on Twitter because I've listened to his opinions for a very long time and disagreed with like 4 or 5 of them. I just find him exceptionally sharp. And I guess the reason I'm saying all this is as a plea to your listeners that if you're interested in questions of not just what is QAnon, why does it matter, but how can I think about the way that, movements like QAnon work, why they work, what features might propel them to prominence and what they might look like in the future. Go to academics too. Don't just go to somebody who, like me, is fundamentally an internet rando. The people who get paid to think and write about this may take forever to do the writing, but what they come out with is insightful and precious and really sharpens, my thinking. I hope the thinking of a lot of other people who maybe will be interested in like, oh yeah, how does all this work from the perspective of a really keen outside observer who's taking, a decades-long view of it.
You mentioned off the air too, Michael Bazzell, Open Source Intelligence. Is that pronounced that correctly?
Oh, yes. So there is a guy named Michael Bazzell, Bazzell, and he has produced the Open Source Intelligence Bible. It's called Open Source Intelligence Techniques. Open Source Intelligence is sort of the art of taking the enormous amount of data that is available for anyone and everything on the internet and turning it into a concrete set of statements that you can make with, high reliability, high relevance, and once you have that concrete information pinned down, you can start to make conclusions about whatever it is you might be investigating. And if you're interested in trying to produce, good, high quality work of your own on whatever subject you might be interested in, because, I'm interested in QAnon, so I had to dig into a lot of nitty gritty questions about where does this particular post or idea come from? How do we know? How confident are we in that? You might be interested in whatever research question you have. If it's something you can answer by finding data on the internet, whether it is, somebody's social media history, whether it is official weather records, which I absolutely have used in at least one investigation. having a single guide that helps you, take shortcuts to the best methods that people have and warns you about, the pros and cons of sources is enormously helpful. There's also Bellingcat, which is the foremost practitioner of open source intelligence in the world, has a Discord server, and on that server they've got guides for people who are interested in getting into open source intelligence. And I would encourage anyone who wants to, explore that world to pick up Michael's book, join the Bellingcat Discord server, talk to people who understand what they're doing, and then just go for it. Because you can learn a lot, and I mean a lot, from the enormous amounts of data that's out there, and you can really contribute to everyone's understanding of how your particular field of interest might work. If you are willing to do a bunch of work, network with people who, understand how that work is best conducted, listen to feedback, and produce something good, people will listen, word will get out. It's really cool.
So, Al Jones, even though there's really no new drops, the Q movement is not dead. No, I would say that it is transformed into this kind of messaging network, which takes, it takes direction now, not from the Q drops, but like I said, from Fox News, from other conservative media. Gateway Pundit is a big one, and also takes ideas that bubble up from members of the group and pushes them into the sort of broader conservative discussion, first via more, conspiracy spheres of conservative thought that don't necessarily overlap with QAnon, and ultimately often into some of the very outlets I talked about. Basically, it's still a movement. There are still people who use the Q drops to understand the world, but it's also a really efficient messaging apparatus to, talk about your new villain of the moment, spread ideas that underpin and interact with broader conservative concerns, like anti-trans panic, for example, is extremely visible in QAnon settings, you might say, where almost everyone is convinced that there's something called elite gender inversion, and you can follow the slightly more diluted versions of that all the way up to mainstream anti-trans talking points. And when you realize, this is sort of the hardcore version of what is currently inspiring, a major wave of Republican-sponsored legislation nationwide, once again, you see that sort of political impact of people who have beliefs that may be totally separated from reality, but which, nonetheless, A, they form a big part of the Republican base, and B, the more diluted forms of that belief do sort of spread beyond their immediate circles, and ultimately turn into political action. Al Jones.
It's not dead.
We are out of time. Al Jones,
Yeah.
We're out of time. The Q Origins Project on Twitter, at Q Origins. And then if you want to see a huge amount of material, check out dchan.qorigins.org. And Al Jones thinks it's a long article. It's really not. Okay, you go to Bellingcat. It's a one-page article. It's not that long at all. The Making of QAnon, a Crowdsourced Conspiracy. Real quick for the audience, he mentions this Mike Pence, attacks on Mike Pence. One of the more wilder allegations about Mike Pence that was shared by Lynn Wood is attributed to a fellow who I had him on this show 13 years ago. It's the first public appearance he ever did in his life. And I later on discovered that this guy was nuts. And then here you are. People giving this guy some kind of credibility that he's somewhere in reality when, dude, this guy's out there. Al Jones, thank you so much. The Q Origins Project on Twitter. It's at Q Origins. Once again, the Making of QAnon Crowdsourced Conspiracy at Bellingcat. And be sure and check out dchan.qorigins.org. Hey, Al, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.